They called him the man who dared the impossible. Imagine leading an army not across plains, not across rivers, but across the frozen Alps with war elephants, snow biting into your soldiers' faces, and death waiting with every step. That was Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian commander whose name became a nightmare whispered in the streets of Rome. But centuries later, his greatest rival, the man who stopped him, the man who defined the Roman way of war, rose to answer him, Scipio Africanus. And here's the question we still wrestle with today. Who was the greatest general of the ancient world? Hannibal, the bold gambler who defied logic, or Scipio, the disciplined strategist who broke the unbreakable? Let's pull back the curtain and confront the clash of two military giants. This isn't just about battles, it's about genius, about daring, about legacy. And by the end, you'll have to decide whose shadow truly dominates history. Hannibal's story begins with revenge. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought Rome and lost in the First Punic War. Before Hannibal was even 10 years old, legend says he was brought to an altar and sworn to hate Rome for as long as he lived. Can you imagine carrying that oath in your chest from childhood? That kind of hatred wasn't political. It was personal, and it shaped everything he would become. By the time he took command of the Carthaginian army in Spain, he wasn't just a general. He was the embodiment of vengeance waiting to be unleashed. Now contrast that with Scipio. Born into the Roman elite, he grew up not in bitterness, but in duty. He saw his father and uncle fight against Hannibal. He saw Rome humiliated at battles like Cannae, where tens of thousands of Romans were slaughtered. Scipio himself was barely 18 when Hannibal invaded Italy, yet he survived those disasters and swore his own oath, not of hatred, but of resolve. Rome could not fall. Rome would not fall. Two young men on opposite sides, both shaped by oaths, both rising in the fires of war. Already you can see why history remembers them as mirror images. Hannibal, the avenger. Scipio, the defender. When Hannibal set out on his legendary march, the world laughed. Who in their right mind would drag an army through the Alps? The freezing winds, the avalanches, the narrow cliffs where one wrong step meant an entire column falling to its death. His men mutinied, his elephants stumbled, yet somehow he made it. He didn't just survive the Alps. He emerged into Italy like a thunderbolt, a force Rome had never expected. Imagine being a Roman farmer and seeing Carthaginian war elephants stomping across your fields beasts. It seemed almost mythical. That shock was Hannibal's weapon, and he wielded it like no one else. At the Battle of Trebia, then Lake Trasimene, and ultimately Cannae, he humiliated Rome again and again, killing tens of thousands, surrounding armies that were supposed to crush him. At Cannae, historians still teach his tactics as the gold standard of battlefield maneuver. Outnumbered, he encircled the Romans, trapping them like prey in a net, turning one of Rome's largest armies into a mass grave. If military genius is defined by doing the impossible, Hannibal's case is undeniable. But genius has limits, doesn't it? For all his victories, Hannibal never marched on Rome itself. He stood at the gates more than once, but something held him back. Was it logistics? Was it the lack of reinforcements from Carthage? Or was it hesitation? A calculation that Rome would be too strong, even wounded. This is where the debate heats up. Great generals aren't just judged by victories. They're judged by what they fail to do. And Hannibal's failure to destroy Rome outright opened the door for Scipio to rise. Scipio's genius wasn't in shocking maneuvers. It wasn't in impossible marches. It was in adaptation. While Rome was reeling, he studied Hannibal. He didn't just fight against him. He learned from him. At battles in Spain, Scipio began to use tactics that mirrored Hannibal's own speed, deception, ambush. He was no longer the Rome of rigid legions marching head-on. He was a Rome that could outthink, outmaneuver, and eventually outlast. When Scipio finally turned the tables and brought the war to Africa, Hannibal was forced to return home. And here is where their destinies collided. The Battle of Zama, 202 BC. Hannibal, the veteran of 2 decades of war, faced Scipio, the rising star of Rome. Elephants thundered forward, Roman lines shifted, Carthaginian infantry clashed. At Zama, Scipio broke Hannibal, shattered Carthage's hope, and earned the title Africanus. Rome would become the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Hannibal, once the terror of Italy, would spend the rest of his life in exile, a defeated wanderer. So here's the eternal debate. Is greatness defined by brilliance in battle, or by the ability to win wars? Hannibal was unmatched on the battlefield. His tactics are still revered 2,000 years later. Yet Scipio won the war. He ensured Rome's survival and its rise to empire. When we weigh them, it's like weighing fire against iron daring versus discipline, flash versus endurance. Which do you value more? Because the answer to that question decides who you think was the greatest general of the ancient world. And let's not forget legacy. Hannibal influenced generals centuries later, including Napoleon. His name became a symbol of audacity. Yet Scipio's victory ensured that Rome would dominate history for centuries. Without Scipio, there might never have been an empire to produce Caesars, emperors, or even the Rome we think of today. Without Hannibal, perhaps Rome would never have been tested to its limits, never forced to evolve into the military machine that conquered the known world. So perhaps, ironically, their greatness is bound together. Hannibal sharpened Rome, and Scipio forged it into steel. But I want to leave you with this. If you were a soldier, whose camp would you rather stand in? The daring Hannibal who promised glory and risk, or the steady Scipio who promised order and victory? One gives you the thrill of the impossible. The other gives you the certainty of triumph. That's the question that keeps historians, strategists, and dreamers debating to this day. When we think of Hannibal, the images that dominate are those of elephants trudging through snow, of Romans crushed at Cannae, of an entire empire trembling at the thought of one man. But Hannibal was more than a battlefield commander. He was a master psychologist. He understood fear as a weapon. He didn't need to conquer Rome directly to strike at its soul. Every farmer who abandoned their land, every senator who feared for their family, every ally who questioned Rome's strength, that was Hannibal's true strategy. He didn't just fight armies. He fought morale, and he nearly broke the unbreakable will of Rome. Think about that. A city built on discipline, on the idea of eternal dominance, nearly unraveling because of one man's audacity. Isn't that a kind of greatness that transcends mere numbers on a battlefield? Yet here lies the paradox. Hannibal's brilliance was tactical, immediate, and devastating. But Scipio's genius was strategic, patient, and enduring. Hannibal could win battles, but Scipio learned how to win wars. And isn't that the deeper measure of a general? After all, history doesn't remember just the thrill of victories. It remembers the shape of empires that followed. Rome didn't crumble. Rome adapted. And it adapted through Scipio. Let's explore that adaptation. After Cannae, Rome was devastated. Tens of thousands of its soldiers were dead. Entire legions wiped off the map. In almost any other society, that would have been the end. A treaty, a surrender, a collapse. But Rome was different. Instead of giving up, the Senate refused even to negotiate with Hannibal. They banned the word peace from public debate. Can you imagine living in a city where even the mention of peace was forbidden because it was seen as weakness? That's the Rome Scipio grew up in. And in that furnace of defiance, he began to rise. Scipio's first real test was in Spain. Hannibal had left his brother Hasdrubal to hold the Carthaginian stronghold there, securing supply lines and reinforcements. Scipio, still a young man, took command of Roman forces and did something unexpected. He struck at New Carthage, the Carthaginian capital in Spain. It was a daring raid, fast and surgical, catching his enemies completely off guard. Hannibal might have shocked the world by marching elephants across the Alps, but Scipio shocked his enemies by showing that Rome could strike deep, adapt Hannibal's own boldness, and turn it against Carthage. That victory in Spain wasn't just a military success, it was a signal. Rome wasn't done. Rome could evolve. This is where the comparison gets fascinating. Hannibal was a master of battlefield innovation, but Scipio was a master of imitation and refinement. He took the lessons Hannibal had taught Rome in blood, and he molded them into something stronger. Scipio trained his soldiers differently, using more flexible formations, more deceptive maneuvers. He studied how Hannibal used cavalry, how he manipulated terrain, and then he applied those lessons with Roman discipline. It's almost poetic. Hannibal was the teacher, Scipio the student. But like in so many stories, the student eventually surpassed the master. And when Scipio brought the war to North Africa, he forced Hannibal into a position he hadn't faced in years, defending his homeland. Imagine Hannibal, after nearly 2 decades in Italy, being recalled not as the hunter, but as the hunted. It must have been a cruel twist of fate. The man who had once stalked Rome itself now stood on his own soil, waiting for Rome to strike at him. That moment was the true collision of destinies. At Zama, the culmination of their rivalry, Scipio demonstrated just how much he had learned. Hannibal's elephants thundered forward, but Scipio had anticipated it. Instead of panicking, he created corridors, lanes through his army, allowing the elephants to pass harmlessly through. He had studied Hannibal's every move, prepared for every trick, and countered them with discipline. The battle unfolded as a symbolic reversal of their entire rivalry. Hannibal, the once unpredictable genius, found himself matched and outmaneuvered by the man who had grown in his shadow. But let's pause here, because this isn't just about military maneuvers. It's about what kind of greatness we value. Hannibal embodied audacity, risk, the willingness to do the unthinkable. He's the kind of figure who inspires movies, myths, admiration for sheer courage. Scipio, on the other hand, embodied persistence, patience, and transformation. He didn't just inspire fear. He inspired survival. So ask yourself, is greatness about the flash of brilliance that changes the game in a single moment, or the steady hand that secures victory for generations? Even their legacies tell us something about this divide. Hannibal, after his defeat, became a wanderer, advising foreign kings, always in exile, always hunted by Rome. He ended his life not in glory, but in bitterness, poisoned by his own hand to avoid capture. Yet his name lived on as a symbol of defiance. Napoleon studied him. Military academies teach him. His spirit became larger than his empire. Meanwhile, Scipio returned to Rome triumphant, hailed as a savior, a conqueror, Africanus. And yet, his end was not much happier. Political rivals undermined him. Envy poisoned his triumph, and he too withdrew into exile, dying disillusioned with the very city he had saved. Isn't it strange? Both men, though so different, ended their lives in bitterness, their greatness unappreciated in their own time. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Greatness in history is rarely rewarded with peace. It burns bright, shakes the world, and leaves the man behind it in ashes. Hannibal and Scipio both carried that burden. The difference is how they carried it, one with relentless defiance, the other with quiet endurance. So I'll ask you again, if you had to choose, who deserves the crown of greatness? The man who defied the impossible, or the man who mastered it? Hannibal, the terror of Rome, or Scipio, the savior of Rome? Perhaps the real answer is that the world needed both, because without Hannibal, Scipio would never have become the general he was. And without Scipio, Hannibal's legend would never have been tested to its breaking point. If Hannibal and Scipio's lives ended in bitterness, their shadows stretched far beyond their graves. And that, perhaps, is the true measure of their greatness. Because when we compare them, we aren't just comparing two generals, we re-comparing two philosophies of power that still echo through history. On one side, daring audacity, the willingness to gamble everything on a single stroke. On the other, discipline, patience, the methodical grind that ensures survival. Which philosophy shaped the world more? That's the heart of the debate. Think about Hannibal's legacy first. Centuries later, Napoleon studied him religiously. The idea of moving armies with speed, of surprising the enemy in ways they could never anticipate, of striking fear as much as blows that came straight from Hannibal. Even modern generals in World War II invoked his name when talking about encirclement and blitz tactics. Cannae wasn't just a battle, it was a manual for the future. Military academies still dissect it, asking students, how can an army surrounded on all sides still manage to destroy its enemy? Hannibal answered that question with precision. His genius was not just remembered, it was institutionalized. But Hannibal also serves as a cautionary tale. You can win battle after battle, but if your homeland doesn't support you, if your resources run dry, your brilliance alone won't carry you to victory. Carthage was wealthy, yes, but divided and hesitant. Hannibal begged for reinforcements, but politics stalled them. By the time his brother Hasdrubal marched with fresh troops, he was cut down before he could join him. Hannibal was left stranded, brilliant but abandoned. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Genius without infrastructure collapses. So in a sense, Hannibal teaches us that no matter how brilliant the individual, without a system behind them, their greatness dies on the vine. Now turn to Scipio. His legacy is quieter, but in some ways more enduring. Scipio showed that adaptability wins wars. He wasn't the most original thinker, but he was the most transformative. He took Hannibal's lessons and absorbed them into Rome's DNA. From Scipio onward, Rome was not just a rigid war machine. It became flexible, cunning, unpredictable. That adaptability is what allowed Rome to expand, to conquer Greece, to dominate the Mediterranean, to eventually swallow Gaul and Britain. Every empire that Rome built after Scipio carried his fingerprints. Without him, Rome might have collapsed under Hannibal's hammer. With him, Rome forged itself into the unbreakable colossus that defined Western history for centuries. And Scipio's influence goes beyond tactics. He embodied the Roman ideal of virtuous duty, discipline, service to the state. But here as the twist, his personal end shows us that Rome devoured its heroes as quickly as it celebrated them. Even as he secured Rome's survival, the Senate turned against him, fearing his growing power. Sound familiar? Rome would repeat this cycle again and again, from Caesar to Pompey, from Augustus to countless emperors. In a way, Scipio was the prototype for Rome's future problem, the general too powerful for politics to tolerate. He set the stage for the tension between military glory and republican suspicion. And isn't that tension one of the central dramas of Roman history? So when we ask who is greater, maybe we should ask instead, who mattered more to the shape of history? Hannibal, the genius who pushed Rome to its limits and forced it to evolve? Or Scipio, the architect of Rome's survival and expansion? It's like comparing the spark to the forge. Without Hannibal, there is no fire. Without Scipio, there is no weapon. Let's humanize them for a moment. Hannibal wasn't just a monster in Roman nightmares. He was charismatic, respected even by his enemies. After his defeat, when he entered exile, some Roman generals admitted admiration for him. They feared him, yes, but they also respected the audacity it took to nearly bring Rome to its knees. And in his later years, advising foreign kings, Hannibal still showed flashes of brilliance, like designing naval innovations for Seleucid fleets. He never stopped thinking, never stopped adapting. That's a kind of greatness, too, the restless mind that refuses to die quietly. Scipio, on the other hand, was not the fiery gambler. He was reserved, almost aloof. He carried himself with dignity, perhaps even arrogance. But he inspired loyalty in his troops, who followed him not because he promised wild risks, but because he promised victory. Imagine being a soldier after Cannae, after years of defeat, and then seeing this young commander rise, steady, unshaken, methodical. He must have seemed like the embodiment of hope, and that hope carried Rome through its darkest hours. There's a reason why their rivalry fascinates us. It's not just about Carthage and Rome. It's about two archetypes of leadership that we still wrestle with today. Do we admire the daring visionary who risks everything for glory, even if it ends in disaster? Or do we admire the steady hand who ensures survival, even if it lacks drama? In politics, in business, in war, we're still asking the same question. Hannibal versus Scipio isn't just history. It's a mirror for how we define greatness in every age. And yet, I wonder, did they ever see themselves as rivals in the way we frame them now? Hannibal, I think, saw Scipio as an inevitable product of his own actions. After Zama, some sources suggest Hannibal admitted respect for Scipio, acknowledging him as a worthy adversary. That respect between two men who had shaped the fate of empires tells us something important. Greatness recognizes greatness. Even in defeat, Hannibal didn't deny Scipio's genius. And even in victory, Scipio didn't diminish Hannibal's audacity. They understood each other in a way perhaps no one else in their world could. So let's ask again, what do we mean by the greatest general? If it's about pure tactical genius, Hannibal takes the crown. If it's about who won, who ensured the survival of their people, who reshaped the world, then Scipio claims it. But maybe the truth is more complex. Maybe greatness lies not in one man or the other, but in the clash between them. Because it's in that clash that history turned, that civilizations rose and fell, that the fate of the Mediterranean was decided. Greatness, then, might not be a crown you can place on one head. It might be the fire sparked when two titans collide. Let's move closer to the battlefield of ideas, the part of history that isn't about swords and elephants, but about what these men represent to us today. Because Hannibal and Scipio weren't just generals. They were symbols. And every generation that studies them isn't really asking who was greater. They're asking, what kind of greatness do we value? That's why this debate refuses to die. It's not just academic. It's personal. Consider Hannibal again. He represents audacity, imagination, a willingness to embrace risk. Crossing the Alps wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a declaration that the impossible can be attempted. Think about how often history is changed by people who dared to ignore the rules. Hannibal is the archetype of that spirit. The same spirit you see in explorers who set sail into unknown seas, in inventors who gamble everything on a wild idea, in leaders who defy convention. Hannibal whispers to us, do you want to be safe, or do you want to be extraordinary? And that's why, centuries later, his name still inspires. But then there's Scipio. He represents discipline, patience, the understanding that victory isn't about dazzling moves, but about building systems that endure. Hannibal shocked Rome, but Scipio transformed Rome. That transformation is what kept Rome alive and dominant for centuries. If Hannibal is the fire of inspiration, Scipio is the steel of endurance. And isn't endurance what truly defines civilizations? Flash burns bright, but endurance builds empires. Scipio whispers to us, do you want glory for a moment or stability for a lifetime? This is why their story feels so relevant. We live in a world that constantly swings between these poles. Visionaries who gamble at all, and pragmatists who secure the foundations. Tech entrepreneurs who risk collapse for breakthrough, and managers who quietly build sustainable growth. Politicians who dazzle with fiery speeches, and administrators who quietly get things done. Hannibal versus Scipio is still playing out in boardrooms, in governments, in wars, even in our own personal choices. Let's not forget the human cost of their rivalry. Hannibal's brilliance came at the price of unimaginable suffering. His men froze in the Alps. His elephants died by the dozens. Italian soil was soaked in Roman and Carthaginian blood. His gamble nearly toppled an empire, but it also destroyed countless lives. Scipio's patience meant dragging wars on, wearing down enemies, exhausting resources. His victory at Zama wasn't just triumph, it was the beginning of Carthage's slow strangulation, a process that would end in the city's total destruction decades later. So when we celebrate their genius, should we also question the cost? Is greatness worth the rivers of blood it demands? That question, too, remains timeless. Think of this. Hannibal's victories showed the limits of brute force. Rome, for all its might, could be humiliated, could bleed, could nearly fall. But Scipio's endurance showed the power of resilience. Rome didn't fold after Cannae, even though by all logic it should have. Instead, it adapted. Isn't that the ultimate message? Greatness doesn't lie in never being defeated. It lies in refusing to stay defeated. Hannibal gave Rome its greatest defeats. Scipio gave Rome its greatest comeback. And maybe that's why their story resonates so deeply, because all of us have lived both sides. We've all been Hannibal at times, daring and bold, and Scipio at times, steady and enduring. Let's dive deeper into Zama, because that battle deserves more than just a summary. Picture it. Hannibal, in his 50s, weary but still formidable, standing across from Scipio, not yet 40, burning with purpose. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of generations, of philosophies, of destinies. Hannibal brought elephants, veterans hardened from years in Italy, mercenaries still loyal to his cause. Scipio brought disciplined Roman legions, cavalry alliances with Numidian horsemen, and the confidence of a city that had refused to die. When the dust settled, Scipio's adaptability won the day. But imagine being there, seeing Hannibal's elephants thunder forward, seeing Roman formations calmly parked like water, absorbing the chaos without breaking. That moment was symbolic, the age of audacity giving way to the age of discipline, the veteran overshadowed by the student who had mastered him. And yet, Hannibal did not break easily. He fought with courage at Zama, his tactics still sharp, his soldiers still loyal. His defeat wasn't incompetence, it was inevitability. Rome had grown stronger from his very presence, forged by the hammer of his genius. In a strange way, Hannibal created the Scipio who defeated him. And that irony is what makes this story unforgettable. It's not a tale of one man's triumph and another's failure. It's a tale of how greatness breeds greatness, even when it destroys itself in the process. Let's also consider how they were remembered in their own time. To Romans, Hannibal was the boogeyman, the monster at the gates, mothers frightening their children by whispering his name. To Carthaginians, he was a hero, a symbol of resistance, even in defeat. Scipio, to Romans, was the savior, the one who delivered them from annihilation. But to his political enemies, he was a dangerous rival, a man who threatened the delicate balance of republican power. Isn't it telling that both men were celebrated abroad, yet distrusted at home? Greatness often alienates those closest to it. That's a lesson repeated across history. The higher you rise, the more your own people fear you. So I'll turn the question back to you. When you think about greatness, do you admire the one who shook the world even if he lost, or the one who saved the world even if he was never loved for it? Hannibal gave us stories that echo through legend. Scipio gave us an empire that lasted centuries. If you had to choose, which matters more, the story or the survival? And maybe this is why, even now, debates about Hannibal and Scipio ignite classrooms, inspire documentaries, and fuel late-night arguments. It's not just about who won. It's about who we are. Do we see ourselves in Hannibal's daring, or in Scipio's endurance? Do we crave the lightning strike of audacity, or the steady flame of resilience? These men live on in us, not as dusty names in history books, but as archetypes we still wrestle with. In the end, the rivalry of Hannibal and Scipio is less about a single answer and more about the questions it forces us to confront. What does it mean to be great? Is it brilliance that dazzles and terrifies? Or is it endurance that secures survival? Is it the fire that shocks the world, or the stone that shapes it for centuries? Hannibal and Scipio are not just historical figures. They are reflections of two sides of human ambition. Picture Hannibal one last time. Standing on a cold mountain ridge, staring at the snow-covered Alps, knowing his men are freezing, his elephants faltering, but refusing to turn back. That's greatness. Not because it guaranteed victory, but because it redefined what was possible. He showed the world that Rome could be shaken. He showed every future commander that audacity itself can be a weapon. Even in defeat, Hannibal's ghost stalked Rome for generations, haunting senators, fueling paranoia, and inspiring admiration. His name never disappeared, because true greatness does not require victory to live on. Now picture Scipio, not on a mountain, but on a battlefield in Africa, facing Hannibal across the plain of Zama, his formations disciplined, his soldiers calm, his strategy clear. He had studied every move, every trick, every possibility. He wasn't dazzling. He wasn't dramatic. He was precise, deliberate, unshakable. And that steadiness won not just a battle, but a war. Rome endured because of him. The empire that shaped law, language, architecture, and culture for centuries after traces its survival to that moment. Scipio's greatness was not in a single act of daring, but in ensuring the very survival of a civilization. And so the question returns, what do we value more? Hannibal's audacity or Scipio's endurance? The conqueror who almost toppled an empire, or the defender who secured one? Hannibal is remembered as the general who fought with impossible odds, who struck terror into the heart of Rome, who showed the power of boldness. Scipio is remembered as the general who learned, who adapted, who turned defeat into triumph. Both legacies shine, but in different lights. One is the blaze of a comet, the other, the steady glow of the sun. Even their deaths tell us something about the cost of greatness. Hannibal, hounded by Rome, took his own life in exile. Scipio, betrayed by his political rivals, also died in exile, disillusioned. Isn't that tragic? Two of the greatest generals in history, abandoned by the very people they fought for. It shows us that greatness is rarely rewarded with peace. The world uses men like Hannibal and Scipio, then casts them aside. And maybe that is the cruelest truth of all. Greatness is admired from afar, but feared up close. But here's the twist. Maybe the debate itself is the real legacy. The fact that we're still arguing, still comparing, still inspired 2,000 years later, that is their victory. They achieved immortality, not through temples or monuments, but through the endless fascination they spark in us. And isn't that a form of greatness that surpasses even empires? Rome fell, Carthage burned, but Hannibal and Scipio still live in our imagination. So I'll leave you with this. Imagine you are on the battlefield. The banners wave, the ground shakes, the choice is yours. Do you stand with Hannibal, the gambler, the man who dares the impossible, who promises glory but risks everything? Or do you stand with Scipio, the steady hand, the man who assures victory, who sacrifices brilliance for endurance? There is no right answer, only the answer that reflects what kind of greatness you believe in. Some will say Hannibal was the greatest because he inspired awe, because his brilliance shines brighter than any Roman victory. Others will say Scipio was the greatest because he secured the future, because his discipline changed the world. But the truth is, we need both. History needs its dreamers and its pragmatists, its gamblers and its guardians. Hannibal pushed Rome to its breaking point. Scipio ensured Rome would not break. Together, they forged the crucible of empire. And maybe that's the real story. Not Hannibal or Scipio, but Hannibal and Scipio. Because greatness isn't one-sided. It's the clash, the friction, the fire created when two titans collide. That's what changes history. That's what shapes the world. And that's why, even now, we ask, who was greater, Hannibal the bold, or Scipio the steadfast? I want you to decide. Was it the man who marched elephants over the Alps, or the man who outmaneuvered those elephants at Zama? Was it the man who nearly destroyed Rome, or the man who guaranteed Rome's survival? Comment your choice. Argue it, defend it. Because in debating their greatness, you not just talking about history, you talking about what kind of greatness you believe in. Two generals, two philosophies, two legacies. Hannibal versus Scipio. The question will never end. And maybe that's exactly the point.